who rescued an abandoned baby bird and let it nest in her hair for 84 days.
And so he would, curl my hair up, and then once he was tired, he would nestle into the nest he'd made. He always wanted to be close, skin on feather. And then he'd settle down and he would sort of relax his body, and I'd feel this tiny little weight, a feathered pom-pom, breathing quietly, nestling in my collarbone. And then he would make this incredible, very soft chirp. He sounded like a cat purring, almost. And that was his communication, that he was content. And that's what made me fall for him completely, because here was this wild bird who had been born from a tiny egg the size of our little fingernail in a high-up tree, and there he was with me, sort of comforted by the sound of my voice and the beat of my heart, nestling in my own hair. And, I just loved him so much.
I mean, it does sound like this kind of wonderful, almost quite romantic image in a way of this beautiful relationship between this human and this bird. And there is part of me that just wants to buy into that romance wholly, but hygienically, how does that work? Having a bird in your house.
Okay, yeah. So if you think about birds, obviously they poo, just like we do. Actually, they poo more than us. So the smaller birds poo up to about 50 times a day because that's how their digestive system works. They just sort of get it out. So that was a problem. So he would have these little tiny white pellets. They're not disgusting, didn't smell, but there were quite a lot of them. The thing is, though, just like we wouldn't poo in our beds, and nests are essentially just their beds. And so he never pooed in my hair, and I've got really long hair, and he was in it a lot of the time, and he never pooed in it because he would back out of the nest he had made in my hair and politely poo over the edge. And so actually he would therefore sort of end up pooing on my jeans or my top, so I'd have to change my clothes quite a lot, or just get used to it, embrace it. And yeah, he never pooed in my hair. I mean, my hair got incredibly sweaty as we went outside. Bird poo would be insignificant compared with just the rushing sweat of just being outside in the grasslands for so long. So I was pretty disgusting anyway.
That is on Outlook tomorrow. For now, I'm Emily Webb. Thanks for listening.
BBC World Service, and now Witness History, with me, Ben Henderson. All this week, we're marking 50 years since Asians were expelled from Uganda. Today, I'm taking you back to Masindi in western Uganda in the 1960s to explain why and how Asians settled there in the first place.
We could only get those Bollywood movies. We had to be really well to own a television there. So we had little projectors, and the whole community would come and sit in the yard, and they would show a movie there.
This is Jamie Gavani. Her grandparents moved from India to Uganda, where she was born and grew up.
There was an agent in Kampala who would hire them, and there were black and white movies in those days. There were no colour movies. So what they would do is they would charge us a little bit of money, and they would come across from Kampala to Masindi to show us this movie. And the funny thing was that these were in reels, so when one part was finished, you had to wait for the second part to come on again. But by that time, you would have forgotten the story of the first part. But they were lovely days, honestly. They really were.
Asians first went to Uganda in the late 19th century as unpaid labourers brought to East Africa by the British to build a railway. Britain had recently taken over Uganda as a protectorate, meaning they ran it, and they hoped the new railway would open it up to trade. But the wealth generated by the railway came at a horrible price for the labourers. 2,500 of them died building the track, which was so dangerous it became known as the lunatic line. Most died from diseases and accidents, but around 30 labourers were killed in even more grisly circumstances.
One dark night, the familiar, terror-stricken cries and screams awoke the camps.
2 lions known as the Savo man-eaters tormented the workers for months. These words are from the diary of Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson, who led the railway project.
The lion burst into the midst of the terrified group, seized an unfortunate wretch amidst the cries and shrieks of his companions, and dragged him off through the thick thorn fence. Although several shots were fired in their direction, they did not attempt to move until their horrible meal was finished.
Once the lions had been killed and the building work stopped, some of the railway workers stayed in Uganda. They were followed by more and more migrants from South Asia, 2 of which were Jamie's grandparents, Popat and Fatima. Their story begins in Gujarat, in Western India, in the early 1920s, and it was love at first sight.
think my grandfather would have been about 19, and my grandmother was about 16, 17. So my grandmother came from a village, and my grandfather came from another village. The families knew each other. There were no such things like love marriages and that. They were like arranged marriages.
Okay, so maybe not quite love at first sight, but they stuck together through tough times.
My grandparents and families and that, they were farmers in India. And what was happening was there were long periods of drought, so they couldn't make their ends meet.
Because of colonial rule in India, the British had a ready-made source of educated workers they could bring to Uganda. Bypassing the black population, Britain introduced a program encouraging Indians to come over to Uganda for jobs as shopkeepers and civil servants. Jamie's grandparents got wind of the scheme through word of mouth in their village.
And they thought, well, what better than migrate and see if there's better opportunities in Uganda than start their lives there again.
That was Jamie's father's side of the family. The British also had a hand in what her maternal grandparents did.
My mother's side of the family came as well, and my grandfather actually was a teacher in Gujarat. So he was employed as a teacher, but a British in this little village.
But this wasn't passage to a comfortable new life. This was a leap into the complete unknown for a very young family. Jamie's granddad was in his early 20s, and his wife was still a teenager. Neither of them had any real idea of what Uganda was like.
Even if there's honey on the other side, you're going to turn around and you're going to think to yourself that, it's new land, the language barrier, leaving your siblings and family behind. Obviously, they were nervous. They couldn't afford the flights and stuff in those days. And they came on a steamer which took several weeks to go across the Indian Ocean into Mombasa, which is on the coast of Kenya, and then catch the train from there to Uganda.
And how much did they bring to start a whole new life?
One suitcase. I think it would have probably been those metal suitcases with not a lot in it. They brought a little bit of money because they opened up little shops and stuff, but not big wealth, little wealth.
But Jamie's grandparents and their fellow migrants put that little wealth and business know-how to good use when they arrived. 12
families came across, and they started their lives with little shops there, and then my grandfather joined them. And my grandfather, he was good at tailoring, so he used to sew these mosquito nets. He was so hard-working, he was so loyal that he would actually go around those edges twice, for the locals, so that, they would last for a while before they had to come and repurchase again. He knew he'd make money out of them again. They would come back again if they tore, but he didn't want that.
The community built a small village near Masindi Port in western Uganda. It wasn't luxurious, but it was beautiful.
So it's on the east coast. First of all, a lot of greenery, so you could hear the birds chirping. In the backyard of the little house that we had, there was lovely fruit trees. We had mangoes, banana trees, tangerines, everything, Everything was fresh every day. Some houses at the back made of straws. We have a brilliant lake there called Lake Albert, which is very good for fishing and stuff. It was very bare. No lights, no water. You have to fetch the water from the lake, obviously. There was no electricity. So in the evenings, you'd only have those little lanterns. It gets windy in the evenings and gets a bit cold. So what would happen is they would do a bonfire, and the whole village would come and sit around, and they would have corn and cassava and things like that, and then everybody would sit around and have a little chat. That was our outing every evening.
That hard-working ethic meant the community thrived. Jamie's parents were born, and life gradually got more comfortable.
Before, the houses were made out of metal, and as time went on, and more people came in and stuff, I think they became more cement and bricks and proper houses. Initially, they had no cars or anything, so if you saw a car once or twice a year, you'd be really excited. Then there came a bus service going from Masindi Port to other places. Yeah, so I suppose there was expansion in all fields. The money got bigger, the wealth got bigger, and things became easier.
The Asian community, 80,000 out of a population of 10 million, they own nearly all the large shops and businesses. They do all the importing and exporting. They own the factories. They man the skilled posts. In the 70 years since Britain brought them into East Africa, they've managed, quite simply, to take over the economy of Uganda. The Gulf Club, an imperial legacy, now admits Asians as well as Europeans. The Africans are their caddies.
Many black Africans resented the feeling of being left behind in their own land, and it quickly became a political issue.
They were rich, the Africans were poor.
This is a government minister from the time.
They come to our country, they make their money here, and then they start abusing us and loading it over us.
But that wasn't the case in Jamie's family.
Well, it might have been with other Asians and that, but I think I come from a very liberal family. We had black staff. And I don't remember my grandmother ever doing anything like that. They could speak Swahili, and Masindi Port is in a district called Munyoro, so my dad could speak that. Then we had people from across Lake Albert who used to come and shop. They were Choli, so my dad could speak a bit of a Choli as well. They used to call him Rafiki, meaning friend, because they looked on him as a friend. And we mixed in with the locals. The black Ugandans would come to my house as well, and we'd go to theirs as well. So, there was no issue there. Everything was fine. They used to have something called the Lions Club there, where you could become a member of, and then they had dinner and dances and that. They socialized with all communities there.
It is a few seconds to midnight, and the crowd is tense. 68 years of British rule are ending. As the national anthem is played for the last time under British rule, the Union Jack is formally lowered.
Independence was celebrated in 1963 by both Asian and black Ugandans. Little did Jamie's family know that this would be the beginning of the end of their blissful migration. With the British gone, the Asians became public enemy number one, and the new government turned on them. Within a few years, Jamie and her family, including Grandma Fatima, were forced into yet another global migration, driven by the currents of the British Empire. Jamie Gavani now lives with her family in London. She was talking to me, Ben Henderson, for that episode of Witness History from the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, and we're looking for a global youth food champion.
Is there someone who's inspiring you? Someone who's challenging the way we produce, consume, or even think about food?
Nominees must be aged between 18 and 30. To nominate, go to bbc.com/foodchain and click on Award 2022, where you'll also find our terms and privacy notice. Nominations close at 23 GMT on Thursday the 18th of August. In half an hour, we're in the studio.
We meet urban designer James Corner in his New York offices, and as he visits London, where he is working on innovative plans for the new Camden High Line Green Walkway that will run alongside an active rail line.
Coming next, the newsroom. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 3 hours GMT, and this is the newsroom.
Justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more. People around the world no longer need to fear the vicious and determined killer.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Savage. The United States has killed the leader of Al-Qaeda. They found Ayman al-Zawahiri in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Also on the programme, a senior US politician could be hours away from visiting Taiwan in defiance of China.
Such a visit is very much dangerous, very much provocative. China will take firm and strong measures.
Plus, there's a plea to take heed of the so-called endgame of climate change and the Dutch farmers sowing dissent.
In the soccer club, you have executive box with also some hooligans, and they have all the same love for their own club, but they express it on their own way, and that is also what the farmers in Holland will do.
All to come in the newsroom. This is the BBC World Service.
BBC News, hello, I'm Gareth Barlow. President Biden says a US drone strike has killed the Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in the Afghan capital Kabul on Saturday. Mr. Biden said al-Zawahiri had been deeply involved in the September the 11th attacks on the US in 2001, which killed nearly 3,000 people. Speaking from the White House, President Biden also gave a warning to others who wish to do America harm.
To those around the world who continue to seek to harm the United States, hear me now. We will always remain vigilant, and we will act, and we will always do what is necessary to ensure the safety and security of Americans at home and around the globe. Today, we remember the lost. We commit ourselves to the safety of the living, and we pledge that we shall never waver from defending our nation and its people.
Hours before President Biden's announcement, a Taliban spokesman acknowledged there had been a US drone strike on Kabul, but made no mention of Ayman al-Zawahiri. He condemned the strike, calling it a violation of international principles. The BBC security correspondent, Gordon Carrera, says al-Zawahiri was on the US government's wanted list for more than 2 decades.
Ayman al-Zawahiri was once the ideological brains behind Al-Qaeda. An Egyptian doctor who was imprisoned in the 1980s for involvement in militant Islam, he left the country after his release and became involved in violent international jihadist movements. Eventually he settled in Afghanistan and joined forces with Osama bin Laden. Together they declared war on the US and organized the September the 11th, 2001 attacks. It took a decade for bin Laden to be tracked down and killed by the US. After that, Zawahiri assumed leadership of Al-Qaeda, but he became a remote and marginal figure, only occasionally issuing messages.
An international study says that the risks of a climate change catastrophe, including the extinction of the human race, are not being taken seriously by scientists. The authors say that the consequences of global warming beyond 3 degrees Celsius have been dangerously underexplored. Media in the US and Taiwan say the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi plans to visit the island later on Tuesday. Ms. Pelosi is currently on a tour of Asia. China's ambassador to the UN, Zhang Zheng, said such a visit to Taiwan, which it considers to be part of its own territory, would undermine relations between the two countries and would also be provocative.
Taiwan's tendency towards independence is further developing. So if we do not take appropriate forceful action to stop it, the situation might be even out of control. So it's legitimate for the Chinese government, for the Chinese military, to take any action to prevent Taiwan to go further down the wrong direction, namely towards independence.
Analysts, though, say an armed conflict is unlikely. World News from the BBC. The Palestinian Health Ministry says a Palestinian has been shot dead by the Israeli army in the north of the occupied West Bank. He was reported to have been killed during clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians in the Jenin refugee camp. A member of a militia group from Texas who tried to storm the US Capitol armed with a gun has been sentenced to more than 7 years in prison. Guy Reffitt was also convicted of threatening to harm his teenage children who turned him in to the FBI. Mr. Reffitt was the first defendant of the January 6th riot to go on trial. His wife, Nicole, warned others it could happen to them.
We allow our country to keep being driven into the ground by the corrupt, evil politicians here in this city, then one day at your kitchen table, FBI is going to come in and tell you that you stood up at the school board meeting and you are now a domestic terrorist. So wake up, America. This isn't just about Guy Wesley Reffitt. This isn't about just 1-6. This is about our liberties being stomped on.
Bolivia has confirmed its first case of monkeypox in the east of the country. The health ministry said a 38-year-old man in Santa Cruz was in a stable condition. On Friday, Brazil and Spain announced their first deaths from monkeypox, the first known fatalities in the current outbreak outside the continent of Africa. The World Health Organization declared a global emergency in July. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has expropriated about 100 hectares of land to move forward construction of a multi-billion-dollar railway project known as the Mayan Train. The 1,500-kilometer line is already under construction in the Yucatan Peninsula with the aim of linking up tourist areas. The Mexican president declared it as a matter of national security at the end of July after several legal injunctions put its future in doubt. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Savage, and this is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. When it invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the United States said the goal was to stop the Taliban regime hosting terrorists like the Al-Qaeda leadership who plotted 9/11. Now the Taliban are back, and who did the US find living in the heart of Kabul? The Emir of Al-Qaeda himself, Ayman al-Zawahiri. They didn't just find him. On Saturday, they killed him with a drone strike revealed in recent hours by President Joe Biden speaking from the White House.
After relentlessly seeking Zawahiri for years under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump, our intelligence community located Zawahiri earlier this year. He had moved to downtown Kabul to reunite with members of his immediate family. After carefully considering the clear and convincing evidence of his location, I authorized a precision strike that would remove him from the battlefield once and for all. This mission was carefully planned, rigorously minimized the risk of harm to other civilians. And 1 week ago, After being advised that the conditions were optimal, I gave the final approval to go get him. And the mission was a success. None of his family members were hurt, and there were no civilian casualties. I'm sharing this news with the American people now, after confirming the mission's total success through the painstaking work of our counterterrorism community and key allies and partners. My administration has kept congressional leaders informed as well. When I ended our military mission in Afghanistan almost a year ago, I made the decision that after 20 years of war, the United States no longer needed thousands of boots on the ground in Afghanistan to protect America from terrorists who seek to do us harm. And I made a promise to the American people that we continue to conduct effective counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan and beyond. We've done just that. In February, our forces conducted a daring mission in Syria that eliminated the emir of ISIS. Last month, we took out another key ISIS leader. Now we have eliminated the emir of Al-Qaeda. He will never again allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist safe haven, because he is gone, and we're going to make sure that nothing else happens. You know, it can't be a launching pad against the United States. We're going to see to it that won't happen. This operation is a clear demonstration that we will, we can, and will always make good on the solemn pledge. My administration will continue to vigilantly monitor and address threats from Al-Qaeda, no matter where they emanate from.
That was President Joe Biden. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes told us it's a major coup for the president.
I think clearly it is a big win for President Biden, both strategically and politically, something that's actually being acknowledged on all sides of the divided political scene here. It is impossible to understate the impact on Americans, indeed the world, of 9/11 and the lasting wounds of that day. So for the US president to announce that the man who co-orchestrated that attack and others, including the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, that killed 17 American soldiers. This will be very welcome news for many people. I think this was a confident-sounding President Biden. Now justice has been delivered, he said, a strike based on what he called clear and convincing evidence of Zawahiry's whereabouts in that safe house in the Afghan capital.
The US was hugely criticised for leaving Afghanistan when it did and in the manner it did. Can they use this attack to defend their strategy?
Well, probably not a direct defence of that strategy. I think more likely a reminder to Americans that the US is still involved in a military strategy without boots on the ground, when justified, to bring down Al-Qaeda and those that support this group's aims. This drone attack is the first known US strike inside Afghanistan since US troops left the country. I think this move may well bolster the credibility of Washington's continuing assurances, and we've heard several times that the United States, the administration, can still address the threats from Afghanistan without a military presence in the country.
Peter Bowes. Our correspondent in Afghanistan is Sikandar Kermani. I asked him what the Taliban's response had been to the US drone strike.
We had these, what was initially described as rocket attacks on early Sunday morning here in Kabul. Initially, the Taliban just said that they targeted an empty home and that no one had been killed. Then earlier this night, the Taliban spokesman said that their investigations had revealed that the rockets were fired by a US drone, but no mention was made of who the target was or what the result of it was. Certainly no mention of Ayman al-Zawahiri or Al-Qaeda at all, but the Taliban spokesman did condemn the attack and said that it was not in keeping with international norms, and said that this kind of behavior was repeating the mistakes that had been made by America in the past by launching what he called a violation of the accord that the Taliban and the United States had signed when paving the way for the US withdrawal last year.
Ayman al-Zawahiri was a big name, but was he still a big deal? Did he have a lot of influence?
Well, as you say, he was a big name. He was one of those figures who had been with Al-Qaeda from the outset. Al-Qaeda, you know, I think really had diminished as a group over the years. I mean, if you think back to what it was in 9/11 in 2001, when it was the most feared militant group in the world, probably, whereas now it's been rather eclipsed by the rise of, for example, the Islamic State group. So, you know, a recent UN report talked about, for example, the number of Al-Qaeda senior operatives in Afghanistan being in the dozens. Nevertheless, that same report did talk about the dangers that Al-Qaeda could go on to pose in the longer term, and many analysts have talked about Al-Qaeda wanting to eventually revive their ambitions of a global jihad, even if at the moment they don't have the capacity, and also because they're being tacitly hosted, it seems still, by the Taliban. They don't want to embarrass their Taliban hosts who have committed to America and the wider world not to allow foreign militant organizations to use Afghan soil as a base to plot attacks abroad.
Yes, that was the reason, of course, the US went into Afghanistan in 2001. So an Al-Qaeda leader being found in Taliban-controlled Kabul is itself highly significant. What's your reading of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been long assumed and believed that Zawahiri was around the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which has in the past been a hotbed of militant activity. But the fact that he was here in the center of Kabul, it seems, and according to some very credible reports, either in the house of a mid-ranking Taliban official, really does suggest that at least a number of people within the Taliban knew of his presence here and had given their approval for that. And I think that's really what's quite shocking and will be very surprising to even many people here in Afghanistan.
Sikandar Kamani in Kabul. Ayman al-Zawahiri took over as the leader of Al-Qaeda after Osama bin Laden was killed by American special forces in Pakistan in 2011. Before that, Zawahiri was his right-hand man, playing an influential role in the creation and direction of the Islamist group. David Bamford looks back at his rise to the top of Al-Qaeda.
Since Al-Qaeda's creation in the 1990s, if Osama bin Laden was the charismatic figurehead, Zawahiri was the man who implemented its will. In video and audio tapes sent to Arabic television stations in the years that followed the 9/11 attack on the United States, Zawahiri regularly issued startling and threatening messages.
Bush, حسن أهدافك واحكم دفاعاتك.
Bush, fortify your positions and defences and tighten your security measures. For the Muslim nation which had sent you the brigade of New York and Washington has made up its mind to send you more brigades, one after the other, carrying death and seeking paradise.
Despite every effort by the American military and intelligence agencies, both Zawahiri and bin Laden remained at large for many years. When bin Laden was finally hunted down and killed, there was still no sign of his deputy, who was named on Islamist websites as bin Laden's successor. Ayman al-Zawahiri, born in Egypt in the early 1950s, was a doctor by training. As a youth, he became a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which organized resistance against the secular rulers of Egypt. He later broke away to form the more violent Egyptian Islamic Jihad, responsible for numerous gun and bomb attacks, including in 1981 the assassination of Anwar Sadat. When no Islamic revolution occurred, Zawahiri left Egypt because, he said, the terrain was desert and flat, there was nowhere to hide his training camps. In any case, his concept of revolution went far beyond the removal of one single pro-Western Arab regime. He and his followers made their way to the mountains of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there he met and joined forces with the wealthy Saudi renegade Osama bin Laden. Their fusion became the guiding force of Al-Qaeda, ethnic Arab at its heart, but inspiration to violence-prone Islamist movements across the Muslim world. Mohammed Al-Akram is a leading Arab journalist who says there was a constant theme running through everything Ayman al-Zawahiri uttered.
You get the sense that they want to build an Islamic youth army that can have the power to overtake power in the Arab world and to bring us pure Islamic governments into power.
Without Ayman al-Zawahiri's involvement, Al-Qaeda would probably never have existed. He had a street-level Islamist pedigree that Osama bin Laden lacked, for all his charisma, because of his privileged upbringing. Without Zawahiri, the global cause of Al-Qaeda might have been seen as nothing more than the violent indulgence of a wealthy man. For that reason, Ayman al-Zawahiri was central to the worldwide revolution that Al-Qaeda espoused.
David Bamford, you're listening to the BBC World Service. Gareth has this hour's headlines.
President Joe Biden has confirmed that the Al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri has been killed in an American drone strike. Mr. Biden said al-Zawahiri was one of the organizers of the 9/11 attacks on the US and that the strike would bring closure to the families of the victims. And an international study warns that the risks of a climate change catastrophe, including the extinction of the human race, are not being taken seriously by scientists.
Yes, the authors say the world is not prepared for a so-called climate endgame. Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath has the details.
This new study suggests that there are catastrophic risks even at modest levels of climate change that are poorly understood by science. As well as floods and heat waves, there are likely to be compounding effects on food supplies, conflict and disease that significantly amplify the threat from rising temperatures. The international team of authors say there has also been relatively little research on the potential for global warming of 3 degrees and beyond. In that scenario, around 2 billion people will be living with extreme heat by 2070 in some of the most politically fragile and densely populated parts of the world. The researchers are now calling on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to write a special report on the worst outcomes for humanity. This type of study could help governments determine whether extreme interventions, such as pumping coolants into the atmosphere, were warranted. The authors also hope that understanding these grim but plausible results could galvanize political and public opinion. Failing to carry out this type of risk assessment, the authors say, would be fatally foolish.
Matt McGrath. There's still no official confirmation, but media reports suggest that the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, will visit Taiwan later on Tuesday and meet President Tsai Ing-wen on Wednesday. Ms. Pelosi is currently on a wider tour of Asia that began in Singapore on Sunday. The very idea of a senior American politician travelling to Taiwan raises concerns about what China will do in response. Beijing considers the self-governing island part of its territory and has said its military will not sit idly by if the visit takes place. The Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, Jiang Jun, said it was legitimate for the Chinese to take appropriate forceful action.
We can see such a visit is apparently very much dangerous, very much provocative. If the U.S. insists on making the visit, China will take firm and strong measures to safeguard our national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
So what is the US saying? Our State Department correspondent is Barbara Plett-Usher.
The National Security Council spokesman has been giving the latest, and he said the Speaker has not confirmed her travel plans. It's up to her. He said we've been clear that she can make her own decisions, repeating again that Congress is independent of the executive because of the separation of powers, which he said is well known to China. In other words, if Ms. Pelosi decides to go, that doesn't mean that it's something the administration is making an official visit of any kind. He said she has the right to visit Taiwan. It has happened before, which it has. 25 years ago, the Speaker of the House visited, although that was a Republican in a Democratic administration. This is a Democrat in a Democratic administration, which also, I think, colors the Chinese response. But he said, the spokesman, that nothing had changed about U.S. policy. It was not a shift in U.S. policy. In Congress, there is very strong support for Taiwan, for showing solidarity with this self-ruled island, with the democratic government there. She was planning to take a trip to Asia, had meant to go in April, and now is doing it now because she got COVID. But there's speculation that she also wants to make sure she does it this time because she could possibly be retiring in November. There are midterm elections, and it's possible the Democrats could lose the House. And the administration has responded to those threats from Beijing of possible military action, saying there is absolutely no reason for it to turn a visit consistent with U.S. policy, which is how they describe it, into a crisis point for conflict, or to use it to increase military activity around the Taiwan Straits.
Barbara Pletasher. Now, Paul Serres joins us with